Hi, my name is Fred Gardaphé, and this is Calandra Corner. I'm here today with author Frank Lentricchia, the author of many, many novels. I don't even know how many you've got right now up until now, Frank. Do you have the number at the tip of your finger?
I think it's 13.
Could be 13.
If you include one you haven't seen because I completed it in June, a very new one. Yeah.
Frank has been, at least the last 20 years or so, focusing his attention away from literary criticism and onto fiction and creative writing, we could say, fiction, nonfiction. And his latest book is called The Glamour of Evil, and you flip it over, A Place in the Dark. It's a novel and a novella that deals with one of the characters that he's developed in previous novels, Elliot Conti, and we'll get into talking about Elliot. And in this particular pair of stories, he continues the story of Elliot Conti, who's an Italian-American private investigator, private detective, who's good at helping people solve their problems, but I think sometimes pretty terrible at dealing with his own problems. He figures out a way to get through these. And between the two poles of helping these other people and trying to deal with his own problems, there's a tension that's created in the novel that really sustains the reader throughout. And we're going to be talking about what it is that creates that tension. So Frank, what's Elliot Conti doing these days? I mean, I thought this could be the end of Elliot Conti, but it seems like he's got a lot more wind left in him for future works. Are you going to be moving him in other directions? He's somebody you're hanging on to?
Well, in late February of this year, these two novels that we're talking about were completed a little more than a year ago before they came out. So they were all done in early 19. And then in January, while I was waiting for the publication, which occurred as we speak, I started something new. But this time I decided I'd not locate my chief characters in Utica, New York, my hometown, the Italian-American dimension there and so forth. I brought them to Manhattan. And I brought them to Manhattan in very late February, very early March of this year, just before the pandemic hit, particularly in New Rochelle, and then spread through the 5 boroughs. I had them in New York just before this hit. I had written very little. And at that point, I thought, well, now how can I not take into account this terrible context of the virus? So the environment of the new novel, which is a short novel, is the coronavirus.
Okay, so that's where we can anticipate he's going. But let's talk about where he's been up until now. Elliot Conti has this kind of academic past. He grew up in Utica. He goes away to college. He gets fed up with college. And in this particular pair of stories, the novel, A Place in the Dark, and the novella, The Glamour of Evil, let's start with A Place in the Dark. We go back to a time when he's fleeing his PhD studies in search of a way, as he says, to get my hands dirty. This tension between the streets and academia seems to run not just throughout these stories, but in a lot of the work that you do. These different worlds. Elliot seems to be this bridge between these different worlds that come together through him. And on the front seat of his car as he's leaving California, on his way back to Utica, there's a copy of Life magazine. It's the 1969, I think it was December 5th issue. It features a photo essay of the infamous My Lai massacre. And prior to this, it seems Conti has not really thought much about the Vietnam War, or at least it's not it affected him as much. But this seems to be the story that kind of shakes him from his apathy so hard that it resurfaces later when he gets a client, this Vietnamese American woman who comes to him for help in locating her daughter. One of the things I've always admired about your criticism is that your ability to not only historicize the criticism but politicize it in a sense, and not having any fear to do that. And I'm wondering what the role that history plays in the creation of this work, in terms of, you picked up on the Vietnam War, and you spend a fair amount of time in A Place in the Dark dealing with things that happened in Vietnam. Does this come from research that you did, or does it come from memory, or does it come from imagination?
All three, of course. I didn't have a personal experience in Vietnam. I was not drafted. So the setting in Vietnam comes from heavy reading and picture books. Same with Iraq. Same with Baghdad. I had once a friend of mine who didn't know my background, but who read one of my earlier novels, which was set partially in Baghdad.
Is that the Book of Ruth?
That's the Book of Ruth. And he said to someone else, a third person, a mutual friend, gee, Frank went to Baghdad, I see. How could he really did that? No, he didn't. he read a lot. He looked at photographs. And then, of course, the most important part, something that's difficult to define, of course, is he used his imagination, which is what I think writers do.
Right, but it seems to me that Conti is this man who's deeply rooted in, whether it's the history of his personal past. As you begin to write more and more about this guy and especially this place, Utica, I do something that Anthony Tamburi once suggested critics might do when they've read a body of work of a writer, and that is to work their way backwards. And so I'm seeing elements of Conti inside a lot of your earlier figures, like especially the music of the Inferno. And what happens is each work illuminates the earlier work, and he calls this the retrospector. In other words, if typically when we go to a writer, we read them in chronological order from the early novels. But what happens is, yes, you read those as the writer produces. But the one thing I've learned, if anything, about being a writer about writers is that if you try to pinpoint the writer in any kind of autobiographical way in a novel, whether it's a roman à clef or whatever it is, you fail. You fail because the novel is the place the author no longer is. The author
Right.
is somewhere else.
That's correct.
And I think you even published this essay I did on Jay Perini, where I talk about this. But the idea of Elliott Conti being this kind of evolution of this character who is deeply rooted in the past, and yet quite effective in the present. I mean, one of the things I find regularly is that people who are kind of stuck in the past are oblivious to what's going on in the present and only see things, as Marshall McLuhan would say, looking in that rear view mirror as you're driving down the road. You keep looking back, but you have no idea of where you're going. Whereas I think with Elliott Conti, we keep moving further and further into things that matter today, not just the history. Of course, the Vietnam era is an era that has been written about primarily by the soldiers. Many of the soldiers who've written novels and stories about that, but it doesn't seem to have been a great area of critical and scholarly attention in terms of literature.
Well, let me just say this. What I work hard for always in my fiction is a very to present a particular sensuous, vivid sense of place, whether it's Utica, New York, or Saigon, or Khe Sanh, or Baghdad, places, whether they're Utica or in Vietnam or in Iraq. I want them to be presented with as much vividness as I can manage. So those places have to be as alive for me as my hometown, which I'm familiar with as a person, as in my life.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So that was the thing that most challenged me and gave me the most. What gave me the most pleasure, for example, was the settings in Saigon and in Khe Sanh, in that horrible place where the Marines, their 8,000 Marines, were surrounded by 40,000 North Vietnamese regulars, and it looked for a long time that was the end of them. So presenting the particulars, the vividness of Khe Sanh and of Saigon, and then later earlier in Baghdad was critical for me, was the thing that moved me, gave me the most pleasure, because it was the most challenging. And rendering places, especially places that I personally have never been, was the most pleasurable. Yeah.
Right.
I'm glad you said that that the autobiographical Frank disappears from his work. Exactly so. I mean, I can't think of anything more boring than rendering my own life.
Right.
If you write a memoir, okay, or a formal autobiography, okay. But if you're writing fiction, autobiography is the smallest part, if any.
Right. But this shift from this academic. I mean, there's wonderful scenes in earlier novels where Elliot Conti is holding the dean of his division out the window, and
something we all want to do with upper administrators.
But taking the reader who's coming to Lentricchia with these two, let's say the first time, we don't necessarily have all that background, although we have hints inside A Place in the Dark that something really upsetting happens in academia. Not upsetting so much as frustrating. And this idea of moving him into a private investigator, where does that come from?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
See, a lot of I don't mean to be coy here.
No, I think it's...
I want to say that sometimes questions about where my stuff is coming from are unanswerable by me because I don't know. Because they come from God knows where. If they don't come from me autobiographically, which mostly they do not, then where do they come from? Well, we say they come from your imagination. Well, that's a magical word, you know. What do we really mean by your imagination?
Right. One of the points I think I get from that shift is the idea of work. And I always find inside your writing this sense of what is work, what isn't work, and then what is play and what isn't play. And it seems to me that, you know, getting your hands dirty, you know, the first time I came home from a teaching job, I did look at my hands and they were clean. I didn't have frostbite from working in a warehouse with no heat or working outside. And I noticed the more and more, you know, because I used to work in a warehouse with boxes and stuff and my hands would get rough and I'd go to shake somebody's hand. In fact, one time I had my mentor, boss, had me go get he didn't like my long hair, so he had me get a haircut, and he also had my hands. It was the first time in my life I had my hands manicured, and this woman said, "Oh my God, what do you do?" the calluses on the hands, the cuts on the hands, and all that. So this idea of getting his hands dirty.
I know about that, by the way.
Right.
My jobs as a teenager were in a slaughterhouse. Talk about getting your hands dirty. I started finicky. I would wear gloves. And the foreman said after a certain point, he says, "You won't wear the gloves." Then we would have a coffee break and someone would bring, some vendor would come with sweets and coffee. And guys would just rush out at the slaughterhouse and have their little break. Before I went out there, I'd wash my hands. There came a time, I hate to tell you this, but I'm going to tell you, I didn't wash my hands anymore because what was the point?
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, no. But the idea of, this, academic life, doing this and so Conti moves on from this, and he really does get not only into the dirt of work, but the dirt of other people's lives. I don't want to spend the whole time on A Place in the Dark, but it really sets up some expectations that when we get to the end of A Place in the Dark, which is it's the bigger part of the publication, before we have to turn it upside down. It leaves us with a lot of questions, and we want more. And I kept saying, okay, well, let me flip it over now and go to a completely different thing. And at first I thought, okay, we're in a different thing. We're going somewhere else. And then Elliot comes back because Elliot is in a situation where he's getting older now. He's having some medical problems, life-threatening medical problems eventually. And then we're left. Is his obsession with his upcoming surgery is it going to be realized? Is he going to survive? Is he not going to survive? So it was literally a turning point, and that means you got to turn the book over to go to the other side, to the Glamour of Evil. And in the Glamour of Evil, we get hit out of left field with this character of Joey Gallo. Joey Gallo, who I know a little bit about the gangster figure Joey Gallo.
Crazy Joey Gallo,
yeah. And then he was in the movie The Irishman, and he was played by Sebastian Maniscalco. But the author here turns him into a kind of a literary aficionado.
I didn't turn him into that. See, what most people don't realize about this crazy Joey Gallo mafia figure, a very violent man, the most violent, who did things that are unspeakable to people, not just shooting them, unspeakable violence. And he was also, however, all along, a reader, a serious reader of French philosophy and modern American fiction. That's true. I didn't make that up. Well, I did a lot of imagining and decorating around all of that.
Right.
But those are facts. Yeah. I thought that would really grab you because
it totally grabbed me, but I wasn't sure. I mean, I don't know enough about Gallo to know. I never saw a picture of him standing in front of his library, for example.
No, neither.
Or a picture of him with a book in his hand. So, I mean, what this did was it did grab me, and it woke me up in a way that, you don't. There's another side to what we might call evil. There's another side to what, and there's always this development. It's like when I was a kid, I ended up writing an essay, which I never published, called The Other Space of Al Capone. Because when I came home from school, my grandfather once asked me, "What did you do today in school?" I said, "Oh, we learned about Al Capone." He goes, "Oh, yeah? What did they tell you?" And I said, "Well, he was a killer, and he sold illegal whiskey." And he said, did they tell you that he gave a lot of people jobs when they couldn't get jobs? I said, "No." Did they tell you that he set up a soup kitchen for Italians when the Italians were not even allowed into the soup kitchens? No. Did they tell you he built an orphanage for kids? No. He goes, well, he said, "What kind of school you go to? They don't teach you everything." And so I began at that point to see that there's always another side. And then when I found out that the people in my neighborhood that I grew up with were accused of organized crime and been newspapers and so on, I didn't know that side of them. I only knew them as fathers who played baseball with us. And so there is this, and I see this happening with Gallo, and
correct.
It's a moment of kind of potential redemption. We're not going to redeem Joey Gallo because he cared so much about literature, but it does make us look into this character in a different way. And to me, the best of fiction does that. It makes you see things differently. I want to talk a little bit about this particular novel, The Glamour of Evil, because you have it's set up in a way that I wasn't quite sure where it was going, but I was curious, especially with a character called the Reader.
Right. You could be the Reader. That could be Fred.
Right. It could be Fred. But the Reader is somebody who has this connection.
Seriously, Fred, you who are seriously interested in gangster figures are an intellectual like the Reader.
Right. No. I totally understand.
You are drawn to that interest into those figures, just as this character was, just as Conti was.
But he's the one character in a way. I mean, Conti comes from that too, but Conti doesn't seem to have the kind of the background that the Reader has. The Reader he is an associate of some sort. He knows Gallo. He's a kid who goes in and gets to know Gallo. We don't know exactly what he does inside this world of organized crime.
We do sort of know, because he's very deeply associated with one of the chief mafia dons in New York. He's an associate of this guy. This guy is interested in him, the Reader, the Don is, because he's interested in this fellow who can speak well.
Right. He's the one guy where he could, he's not going to talk about literature to his other organized crime buddies, but he can talk to this guy about it.
Yeah.
So then I'm thinking, where the heck is Elliot Conti going to come in? Are we going to find out if he gets through his surgery? Are we going to?
Yeah,
we do, and you do it in such a way that I thought, well, is this really a second book, or is this a continuation of that book? And it's both. It's both, and it warrants this. Wernicke did a beautiful job, I think, of doing this, and
beautifully done, beautifully produced.
I can't remember. Is there a history of flip books before?
Yes, it's a very obscure concept in publishing. Back in the 40s, in cheap paperback versions of science fiction novels, they would put two together the way this book was put together, as a flip book. You read one, you turn it over, you start another one. There is no front cover, in other words. There are two front covers. So this is a very old concept, which is pretty much unknown, which Wernicke resuscitated here.
All right, so it wasn't your idea?
No, I had no idea. Early on in my career, the earliest fiction was Johnny Curtelli and the Knifeman, two short novels published by Scribner back in the early 90s, or whenever it was, 94. And those are printed back to back. There was a front cover and there was a back cover. You read one and you started the other. This one, you read one and you get to the end, and the last page after the end of the first one is the last page of the other one. So you flip it over, you see print upside down after you finish A Place in the Dark. And what you see upside down is the last page of The Glamour of Evil. So you flip the book over and you start at the beginning. Yeah, but no, exactly. This was not my idea. I saw the publisher in Toronto before when he decided what to do with this, and he showed me an example of one, and he had published one other this way, and And I thought the book was beautiful. I especially like the fact that they have flaps. These books, I like paperbacks.
Yeah, I like books with flaps. I need the flaps as a reader. I need the flaps.
Yeah, they're also good looking. Let's face it.
Good looking. I put stuff in there, stuff I forget. Sometimes I get mail and I put it in there, and later I go to my bookshelf. Oh, there's that check I was looking for or something.
So let's not forget the immigrants, though. I mean, in A Place in the Dark, it's very much about immigrants. A Vietnamese woman and the Iraqi fellow. In those two characters are critical.
Yeah, critical in the sense that they echo back, I think, to what people may have an experience in their family with immigration, but it really brings us into what's going on today with this, and not just the stereotypes, but the impact America has on creating these immigrants. I mean, a lot of times we think that it's the fault of the countries where the immigrants come from, but in both these cases, it's the fault of America, really. I think.
Yeah,
it forces their immigration.
Well, we wouldn't be here talking if the attitude toward immigrants today was in place back then. Right. We wouldn't be here.
Absolutely. No,
yeah. I have a cousin. I shouldn't talk about this, but I have a cousin who lives in Florida now. That's where all Italians in New York State go to finish out their lives in Florida. They go to Florida to die, and they go to Florida to become right wingers. So let's add that to this. And she's very anti-immigrant, by the way. And her father is a Sicilian. Think of that.
Yeah.
I don't bring this up to her.
We recently did, Italics recently did a program with Joe Shora and a professor of immigration history who's looked at Jewish and Italian immigration from 1882 to the 1950s and 60s. And she said it was, people, Italian Americans today may say, well, at least my family came here illegally. But what we don't know and what we don't pay attention to, and what the scholar so wisely did in her book, was it was easier to be legal back 100 years ago than it is today. Every time there's been an immigration reform, it tightened until you get to the point where the two immigrants in this particular book, run into situations that the Italians never would have run into in the past. So.
When were they able to become naturalized citizens? When they first came over in the first decade or so of the 20th century?
Almost pretty soon, pretty quickly. A lot of them were naturalizing. The Jews were naturalizing as quickly as possible.
How about the Italians?
Italians, it took a little bit while, but they were, because there's a lot of people now who are trying to. My grandfather became naturalized in 1933.
When did he come over?
He came over the first time in 1920. So that's 13 years it took him.
Uh-huh.
And the only reason I know this is because I'm applying for Italian citizenship.
Who to do? We're doing this now for our daughter.
Right. I'm doing it for my son. I mean, I could have done it 30 years ago. And anyway, we're moving on to a whole bunch of other things. But I think it's important that you do tie not just the history of the Vietnam War, but the results of that. I think in the character, a character who fascinates me, and we could talk on and on about this, but we're getting close to the end of our time. Ritrona. What a wonderful character he is. He seems to embody, some of the. A lot of, if anybody's a wise man, it's Ritrona in many respects. And he reminds me of some of the guys, like when I went to Utica, when Bob Cimbalo and Mario and these other guys took me around, and just the guys from the old neighborhood, But he has this kind of lovely sophistication. He has risen above the, above his background, in a sense that he doesn't become Rentrona, at least the way I see him, would not become this right winger who would move to Florida.
No. But the thing about Rentrona that pleases me most of all in the making of this character is that he has this insight, as you say, this wisdom, what you call wisdom indeed, but it's always expressed in terms that are of the street,
right? Not
of the, Right.
And that's what I mean. He's not a book man. Elliot reads books. Elliot thinks, he's connected very strongly to Hemingway. I think the way you use Elliot's student as the photographer later on, I mean, it's such a rich novel that we could go on and talk about this for hours. Is there any other things you would like to tell us about this book before we conclude our interview?
God, I don't know. The problem for me talking about what I've written is that I have a difficult time remembering what's in the novels. Right. This always happens with me, by the way. Any book I write, once it's done, it's like it was written by another person in another century, and I have almost I have no memory hardly of it. Before we started talking an hour ago, I looked at the book again. I said, "What is in there?"
Right. Well, I think when you are really deeply involved in your writing, and it finally gets to be published, it's not you anymore. You become something else in the process of writing that book, and it is somebody else.
You're in another zone,
exactly. And I think, I never used to understand why movie stars didn't want to see their movies anymore on TV. I've never seen my film. And I totally understand it. I once had a student quoting somebody. She was working on her dissertation, and I said she attacked this critic, and I said, "Good for you. That guy deserves to be. That's a stupid thing to say." And she goes, "Professor, that's you." It was something I had said in a very early essay, and I said, "Well, good. Attack it. It's not me anymore. That's the me I was when I began trying to figure out these things." And so this idea of moving along, and it seems to me like every case that Elliot Conti gets, it kind of renews his life. So I think I'm looking forward to his next thing he gets into, especially now that he. I'm not going to do any spoiler alerts about what happened.
It's set in New York. It's set in Manhattan during the pandemic. The title is One Last Walk. The last line of the novel is Un'ultima passeggiata.
Un'ultima passeggiata, the last one. All right. Well, we've been talking with Frank Lentricchia, author of the novel A Place in the Dark. And flip it over, you get the novella, The Glamour of Evil, published by Guernica Press. You can get it anywhere, Amazon and any of the independent bookstores where you can purchase them online, or I don't know who has the guts to go inside of a real bookstore anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
But, hopefully we will, because it's like people don't go into the stacks anymore. They don't go in the stacks in the library. And most of my discoveries in my academic career came from being in the stacks.
Exactly.
Accidental encounters, a book falling down, me being on the wrong shelf or something like that. So,
or going to the right shelf, seeing the book, and then the ones next to it.
Exactly. All right, Frank, this has been great. Thank you.